Okay, this is the Civil War Objective 3 about how the war ended in 1865. But before we can get into the end of the war, we've actually got to make sure Lincoln is still in office here. So let's back up to the fall of 1864, if we could, for a second, and take a look at letters A and B on the outline. Now, Lincoln is experiencing all sorts of trouble, starting with people in his own party who are questioning him and the war. If that's not bad enough, he's got the opposing party, the Democrats, who are against him as well, although some of them were being split by the war itself. People who were against Lincoln were known as the Peace Democrats because they wanted to see the war come to the close, and those who actually supported the war but were Democrats and supported Lincoln were known as the War Democrats. You can see that on A2 in the outline. Still, there was another group, the Copperheads, who went to extreme methods to ruin any Lincoln plan that he had. Now, the Copperheads, a lot of those were from the butternut region of southern Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois that had been discussed before. Former Southerners that had moved to the northern banks of the Ohio River and had always given Lincoln some trouble. So Lincoln's got the deck stacked against him, and this isn't going to help. The Democrats put up against him in the election of 1864 an old friend of his, General George McClellan, who was the general that Lincoln fired as head of the Union Army twice earlier in the war. So in order to keep everybody happy, Lincoln does a couple of measures to get reelected, and he didn't think it was going to be by much. The first one that he does is that he basically calls the War Democrats over and forms a brand new party with them. They dump the Republican Party label for a while and form into the Union Party because he figures he's going to need some Democratic votes. And the second thing that he does is ask this guy, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, to be his vice presidential candidate. The thought here was that he could keep the border states happy if he was on the ticket, and please the butternuts in the northern banks, or on the northern banks of the Ohio River. The strategy worked, and Lincoln won the election of 1864 by a wide margin. On the battlefield, meanwhile, in 1864 and 1865, we'd finally see what everybody was kind of looking for, two military all-stars going against each other. Finally, for the first time in the Union, it's U.S. Grant, who had replaced George Meade after Meade didn't chase Lee after Gettysburg, against Robert E. Lee, who had established himself as an amazing military general in his own right. Now, it took a while for Grant to get command of Union forces. He'd been fighting in the West most of the time and got command in 1864. The reason was because Lincoln liked Grant's style. Lincoln's style was, if you remember from the siege of Vicksburg, total war. Just grind the enemy down as much as you could, overwhelm them with sheer force of numbers, in this case a 10-to-1 Union manpower advantage. Grant figured this was the best way to win, regardless of the casualties, so his thought was to just keep throwing bodies at the South and use that manpower advantage as much as he could. He also wanted to attack all the Confederate armies at once so that they couldn't reinforce each other. Now, the first time that Grant and Lee match up is right up in Northern Virginia at a place called Chancellorsville. And if you'll notice, every time Lee starts heading south, Grant is shadowing him at Spotsylvania and then meets up with him wherever he possibly can. Now, the Battle of the Wilderness is considered basically a draw, but the CSA is starting to grind down. But it's the battle at Cold Harbor that marks a lot of U.S. Grant's legacy. Now here, Grant really just starts throwing bodies at him, losing in a matter of minutes, around 7,000 men. The northern media are appalled by this whole thing, and they start referring to Grant as the Butcher. And with good reason. These photos here, or this photo here, is taken from the Battle of Cold Harbor. You can see them digging graves in the background and some freshly burned out skulls and other skeletons from the battle site itself. This one right here even still has a shoe on. Now, again, the media was appalled by this, and Grant was referred to as the Butcher, which was ironic because he hated the sight of blood. But, unfortunately for those who disliked the tactic, it was working. Throwing bodies at the South was starting to wear down their numbers. Now, ultimately, what Lincoln wants is to take Richmond, which is the Confederate capital. And the Union does take Richmond, forcing Jefferson Davis to have to relocate here. Danville, which is a Virginia town on the border of Virginia and North Carolina. The condition that Richmond was left in was basically burned out and pounded into rubble. When Jefferson Davis left Richmond, the only thing left to do was try to dig through piles for bodies. So Davis had fled, and as for Lee, there was really nothing left to defend. The only thing he could think of to do was to back off, now having lost a lot of men, and try to regroup and reattack. But he knew that was going to be hard, and as he continues to retreat along the path here, he sees Grant circling around down here, looking for a place to cut him off. As Lee continues west, Grant eventually finds that in Lynchburg, Virginia, in the western part. Now, once they get to Lynchburg, Grant gets papers indicating that Lee might be looking for terms of surrender because his boys may have just had enough. So he picks a meeting place. Not a palace, nothing glamorous. It's basically a farmhouse in a little town called Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Now, it's still there. It's a historical land site. And it's not considered a glamorous place, but it should be, because what you're looking at here is the official place where the Civil War came to a close. Now, the meeting between Grant and Lee was pretty typical of their personalities. Lee believed in honor and glory and showed up in his finest uniform, arriving on a white horse with his saber in all military glory. Grant, typically, was late, covered in mud, wrinkled uniform, and had just been smoking a cigar and smelled like cigar smoke. But they both believed in the honor of war and surrender, and at least in this particular regard, and had respect for each other. Grant does something he never did in any of his previous battles. He respects the enemy enough to grant them terms of surrender. Lee asked that they be allowed to walk out of there with their flag flying high, and that his soldiers be allowed to keep their horses for the upcoming spring planting season. Grant said that they had to lay their weapons down and that everything else would be allowed. And with that, the two sides signed the papers, and the official end of the war comes at Appomattox Courthouse. Now, the Union soldiers cheered when it was done. Grant told them to be quiet, and basically reminded them that these rebels were now their countrymen once again. However, the celebration is not going to last too long, primarily because of this guy. This is John Wilkes Booth, an actor and a Southern sympathizer who had been plotting an assassination of Lincoln for quite some time. And within days of the end of the war at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, he found his chance. Lincoln is attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., takes a seat up in the balcony area in this region right here, and Booth makes his way upstairs to eventually assassinate President Lincoln. Within days of the end of the Civil War, the guy most responsible for making it all happen was gone. Now in the North, of course, they mourned their fallen leader in April of 1865. He was the great emancipator. He was the one who had gotten them through the war. About the only Northerners that weren't upset about it were the Copperheads in Congress, who actually cheered the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, as did the Confederates in the South. Booth, meanwhile, was on the run for another 2 weeks or so, and was eventually cornered and shot in a burning barn. Booth from that point on was seen as a martyr and a hero to the Southern cause, even after the war was over, and the North had another reason to dislike the South again. So even the Civil War was over, in a lot of ways, it wasn't. So when it's all said and done, what is the legacy? Well, we're left with 600,000 dead and 500,000 more wounded in just 4 years. The war costs the U.S. government $15 billion, $221 billion in today's money. And beyond that are the psychological scars. The guys who had been captured from both sides and put into various prison camps, although they weren't as bad as you would think they would be. Prisoners were seen as resources to a war effort, so generally they were respected, held on to, for the most part respected, and fed and just kept until the end of the war so they couldn't be used toward a war effort. In some places, like Andersonville, Georgia, that wasn't necessarily the case. This was a camp for Union prisoners of war, and conditions got bad enough inside that some of the Union soldiers started turning on each other. One particular group, known as the Raiders, was a gang inside who'd been there for quite a while, and anytime new soldiers showed up, they would steal all their stuff and almost beat them to death. Eventually, the other soldiers in the camp rebel against them, and so now, on top of everything else, you have Union soldiers hanging other Union soldiers for crimes within a camp. But that really wasn't the worst thing about Andersonville. The worst thing was the condition that it left the men in. This river running right through, basically a creek, through the stockade area, was where they bathed, where they went to the bathroom, and the water that they drank. Sometimes these guys were even fed salt licks to make them more thirsty to encourage the spread of disease. The result was dysentery, sickness, and a lot of people who looked like this. This is not a prisoner from the Holocaust of World War II. This is a camp member at Andersonville. The leading cause of death at Andersonville was diarrhea, as people would get disease and their fluids would basically drop out from their bodies. So in the end, it's hard to say whether or not the Civil War was good in any way. It did reunify the country. It did give us the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, and the 14th Amendment and 15th Amendments, which gave African Americans rights of all citizens, especially voting rights. But it also caused a rivalry in the North and the South, especially after the death of Lincoln and the way the South cheered on Booth, that still lasts in some cases, even today. It definitely lasted for another 100 years, well into the 1960s civil rights movement. Okay, that's it. Thank you for listening.